The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the county courthouse, casting a golden glow across the marble floors. People hurried through the lobby, some clutching documents, others whispering nervously to family members as they prepared for their hearings. For most of them, this building was intimidating, a place where lives could be changed in just a few words from a judge. Among the crowd walked a young black woman, neatly dressed in a navy suit. Her posture was calm, her steps steady, though her eyes carried a quiet determination. To everyone else, she was just another citizen who had come to seek justice. But for her, this day was about more than just her own rights. It was about standing up to a system that often failed people who looked like her. She had filed a case against 2 police officers who had stopped her late at night without reason. The memory of flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror was still fresh. She remembered how the officers treated her that night, cold, dismissive, and quick to label her as uncooperative, when all she had done was ask why she was being stopped. They had searched her car without cause, embarrassed her in front of bystanders, and let her go without charges as if her dignity had no value. She wasn't just angry, she was determined. So here she was, standing inside the courthouse, ready to tell her story in front of a judge. As she entered the courtroom, she noticed the officers seated on one side of the room with their lawyer. They looked relaxed, almost smug. One of them leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint grin playing on his lips. The other whispered something to the lawyer, who chuckled softly. Their confidence wasn't hidden, it was written all over their faces. On the other side of the room sat the woman alone, with only a folder of documents in her hands. She wasn't intimidated, though. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, observing everything: the polished wood of the judge's bench, the quiet shuffle of papers from the clerk, the muted conversations among a few spectators. Finally, the door behind the bench opened and the judge entered. He was an older man with silver hair and a stern face. His robe flowed as he took his seat, looking down at the courtroom with an expression that revealed little emotion. But for those who knew, his reputation carried weight. People whispered about how he often ruled in favor of law enforcement, no matter the circumstances. His name was spoken with both respect and suspicion. The bailiff called for order and the judge's voice rang out, formal and sharp. "This court is now in session." The young woman took a deep breath. She wasn't naive. She knew the odds weren't in her favor. But she had come prepared, and she believed that the truth, spoken clearly, could cut through even the thickest walls of prejudice. As the proceedings began, the officer's lawyer immediately stood up, speaking with confidence. His tone was smooth, almost rehearsed. He painted the woman as uncooperative during the traffic stop, suggesting she had raised her voice and resisted instructions. The officer sat behind him, nodding as if every word was unquestionable fact. The woman listened quietly, her hands resting on the folder in her lap. She didn't interrupt, didn't frown, didn't roll her eyes. She just waited. When it was her turn to speak, she rose from her seat with grace. She placed her folder on the table, opened it carefully, and looked at the judge with calm eyes. Her voice was steady, not raised, but clear enough that every corner of the courtroom could hear. She explained how she was driving home from work late that night, how the officers had followed her car closely before pulling her over without explanation. She described how they had asked her to step out of the car, searched it without consent, and questioned her as though she were a criminal. She told the judge how humiliating it felt when passers-by slowed down to watch, how her heart pounded as she stood on the roadside under the glare of flashing lights. Her story wasn't dramatic. It was real. She didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate. She just told the truth plainly and honestly. But as she spoke, she noticed the judge's body language. He shifted in his chair, glanced at the officers more often than at her, and occasionally interrupted with questions that seemed less about clarifying details and more about poking holes in her testimony. "Why didn't you comply immediately with their requests?" he asked at one point. "I did comply, Your Honor," she answered softly but firmly. "I only asked why I was being stopped. That was my right." The judge raised his eyebrows slightly but said nothing more. From the corner of her eye, she saw the officers exchange quick looks, smirks tugging at their lips. It was as if they already knew how this hearing would end. The spectators in the room shifted in their seats, some of them sensing the imbalance. A few looked at the woman with quiet sympathy, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Still, the woman did not falter. She presented every piece of evidence she had, her clean driving record, her notes from the night of the incident, and even a recording she had managed to capture on her phone. Each time she placed something before the judge, she hoped he would see what she saw, a simple truth that the officers had overstepped their authority. Yet, as the hearing continued, the judge's tone grew colder. He allowed the lawyer for the officers to speak at length, raising few objections while cutting the woman off whenever she tried to elaborate. It wasn't just subtle anymore, it was clear. By the end of the first hour, it seemed as though the outcome had already been decided, long before she had ever stepped foot in the courtroom. But the woman didn't show defeat. Inside, yes, she felt the weight of injustice pressing down, but outwardly she remained composed. Her eyes didn't lower, her shoulders didn't slump. She stood tall, her voice still steady, her heart still firm, because she knew something the judge and the officers didn't. She knew that today wasn't just about this case. It was about exposing something much larger. As the session wrapped up, the judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk, already preparing to give his ruling. The officers whispered to each other again, their grins widening. But the woman sat quietly, her folder closed now, her hands folded neatly on top. To anyone watching closely, there was a faint glimmer in her eyes, a look not of defeat but of patience. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The air in the courtroom grew heavier as the hearing moved forward. The young woman sat quietly, her folder neatly placed before her, while the officers leaned back with the kind of confidence that made it seem like they were in familiar territory. They looked comfortable, too comfortable, as if they had walked through this process many times before and knew exactly how it would play out. The judge adjusted his glasses and gave a nod to the lawyer representing the officers. That was all the signal he needed. The lawyer rose quickly, buttoning his jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom floor. His voice carried with an ease that came from years of practice. He didn't just speak. He performed, choosing words that painted a picture far different from what had actually happened. According to him, the officers had acted with restraint, professionalism, and fairness. He claimed the woman had been uncooperative, had raised her voice unnecessarily, and had failed to follow simple instructions. His tone was smooth, steady, almost rehearsed, as if the story had been polished to perfection long before they stepped into this courtroom. As he spoke, the officers nodded along. Every sentence he delivered seemed to add weight to their side, and their faces reflected that confidence. One even tilted his head slightly toward the gallery, as if daring anyone to doubt their version of events. The judge listened carefully, leaning forward at times, asking questions that seemed to give the lawyer even more room to expand. "And you're saying she was resisting the entire time?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the lawyer replied, his tone respectful but firm. "My clients acted with patience despite being met with hostility." The young woman sat silently, her hands folded, her expression calm. She did not interrupt. She knew better than to react with frustration. It would only feed into the story they were weaving about her. She had come here with truth, and she intended to let it speak for itself. Finally, when the lawyer finished his long explanation, the judge gave a small nod. "Very well. Let's hear from the other side." The woman stood up slowly, smoothing her suit, and carried her folder to the center of the courtroom. She opened it gently, laid out her notes, and began to speak. Her voice was calm but clear, strong enough to fill the room without ever sounding angry or defensive. She told the judge how she had been driving home from work that night, tired but focused when the flashing lights appeared behind her. She explained how the officers had followed her closely for several blocks before pulling her over, without giving any reason. She spoke about the questions they asked, questions that had nothing to do with traffic laws or safety. She described how she had asked them politely why she was being stopped, only to be met with cold stares and impatient tones. As she continued, she could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. Some leaned forward, listening intently, while others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps unsure of which side to believe. But she didn't let the tension break her focus. She kept her tone steady, her words deliberate. She explained how the officers searched her car without her consent, opening compartments and rifling through her belongings. She told the judge about the humiliation of standing by the roadside as cars passed slowly, their drivers staring. It wasn't just about being stopped. It was about being treated as though her dignity didn't matter. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Then she reached into her folder and pulled out a document, her driving record, clean, not a single offense. She placed it on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still calm, "this is my record. I have never been in trouble with the law. That night was not about me breaking the rules. It was about assumptions that were made about me." The judge glanced at the paper but said nothing. The woman continued pulling out her phone. She had recorded a short portion of the stop, not much, but enough to capture the tone of the interaction. She played it for the courtroom. The faint crackle of the recording filled the space. The voices of the officers clear as they ordered her to step out of the car without giving a reason. Her own voice could be heard, polite but firm, asking why she was being stopped. The recording ended and silence filled the room for a moment. The lawyer for the officers quickly stood again. "Your Honor, with respect, that recording is incomplete. It does not show the full picture. My clients were simply ensuring safety." The judge nodded slightly, not showing much reaction. "Noted," he said, then turned back to the woman. "Do you have anything else?" She nodded. She had taken notes immediately after the incident, writing down times, locations, and details while they were still fresh in her mind. She presented those as well, explaining how she documented everything because she knew this day might come. But each time she spoke, the judge's face remained unchanged, his tone clipped and skeptical. He interrupted her more than once, cutting off her explanations, while allowing the lawyer for the officers to expand freely. At one point, when she tried to explain how the search of her car was unlawful, the judge stopped her mid-sentence. "Were you harmed physically?" he asked. "No, Your Honor," she answered softly. "Then let's stay focused on the facts, not feelings," he replied sharply. The words stung, but she didn't show it. She simply nodded and continued, keeping her voice steady. In the gallery, people exchanged glances. Some could clearly see the imbalance, the way the judge leaned toward one side of the story while brushing aside the other. But no one said anything. No one dared to challenge the authority at the bench. The officers, however, looked even more confident now. They whispered to each other, their shoulders relaxing as if the case was already wrapped up. One even smiled faintly as though he were certain of victory. But the woman did not lose her composure. She knew what was happening, but she also knew she couldn't afford to let frustration show. She finished her testimony with the same calm dignity she had started with, ending simply, "Your Honor, I only ask for fairness. I did nothing wrong that night. I only want the truth to be recognized." She returned to her seat quietly, folding her hands again. She could feel the tension in her chest, but she didn't let it appear on her face. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the desk. He gave a long look at the officers, then back at the woman, before finally speaking. "Very well. I have heard enough for today. This court will take a short recess before I deliver my decision." The gavel struck lightly, and the bailiff called for order as people began to stir. The officers stretched in their seats, clearly at ease while the woman remained still. Her eyes focused ahead. It was clear to anyone watching closely. The judge's tone, his interruptions, his nods, it all hinted at where this was heading. The imbalance wasn't hidden anymore. It was standing in the open for everyone to see. Yet even as the weight of the courtroom pressed against her, the woman sat with quiet strength. She hadn't come here expecting an easy path. She had come knowing she might face bias, knowing she might not be believed, but she also knew something else. Something no one else in that room understood just yet. She knew the story wasn't finished. When the recess ended, people slowly filed back into the courtroom. The murmur of voices quieted as the bailiff called everyone to order. The judge returned to his seat, his robe flowing behind him, and adjusted his glasses with a practiced motion. His face was stern, unreadable, though to many in the room his mind seemed already made up. The young woman sat still, her hands folded neatly on the table in front of her. Her folder of documents was closed now. She had said everything she needed to say, presented every piece of evidence she had. She could only wait. Across the room, the two officers leaned comfortably in their chairs. Their lawyer sat between them, whispering quietly, but all three wore the same look of calm confidence. To them, the outcome was certain. This was familiar ground. The judge tapped his pen lightly against the desk before speaking. "I have listened carefully to both sides," he began, his tone even but heavy. "The matter before us is whether the officers acted outside of their authority during the traffic stop in question." The woman looked straight ahead, her eyes steady, her expression calm. But inside her heart was racing. The judge continued, "Having reviewed the testimony and the evidence, I find that the officers acted within the bounds of their duty." The words landed like a stone in the silent room. The officers exchanged quick glances, faint smiles tugging at their lips. Their lawyer nodded slightly, his expression satisfied but controlled. The judge pressed on. "There is no sufficient proof that misconduct occurred. While the complainant describes the incident as troubling, it is the court's position that the officers acted reasonably under the circumstances." A small pause followed. The weight of the ruling filled the room, though it was not unexpected. The woman felt a wave of disappointment wash over her, but she didn't let it show. She sat perfectly still, her breathing steady, her gaze unbroken. She had prepared herself for this very outcome, knowing that bias could be stronger than facts. The judge closed the file in front of him and leaned back in his chair, almost as if the matter was trivial. "This case is dismissed," he said simply, with no further explanation. The gavel struck. It was over. The courtroom stirred with movement as people began to stand and gather their belongings. A few whispered to each other, glancing at the woman with quiet sympathy. Others avoided looking at her altogether, unwilling to acknowledge the unfairness they had just witnessed. The officers, however, were not subtle in their relief. One leaned back and stretched his arms as though a weight had been lifted. The other whispered something to the lawyer, who chuckled softly in return. To them it was a victory, another challenge brushed aside, another case closed. The judge gathered his papers slowly, preparing to leave. Before stepping away, he glanced briefly at the woman. His expression was cold, distant, almost dismissive. "Next time," he said in a low but clear voice, "consider carefully before wasting the court's time." The words carried a sting, not just for her but for anyone listening. A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. The power of the bench was absolute in that room, and silence was the only response. The woman lowered her eyes for a brief moment, but only briefly. Then she lifted her head again, her face composed, her posture straight. She quietly gathered her folder and rose to her feet. If anyone was watching closely, they might have seen something unusual in her expression. Not the look of defeat, but of quiet patience. It was as though she had been expecting this moment, as though this ruling was not the end of her story but only the beginning of something larger. The officers, still smirking, stepped aside to let her pass. One of them muttered under his breath, just loud enough for his partner to hear. Both chuckled softly. Their lawyer walked behind them, already reaching for his phone as if to share the good news. The young woman did not respond. She walked calmly, each step measured, her shoulders straight. To the casual eye, she looked like someone walking away from a loss. But if one looked closer, there was no defeat in her walk, only quiet strength. The atmosphere in the courtroom lingered heavy. A few spectators stayed behind for a moment, as if trying to process what they had just witnessed. Some shook their heads slowly, others whispered in disbelief, but all eventually left. The judge's decision had been quick, almost careless, but its effect was deep. It left a mark on everyone who had been present. They had seen a story unfold where truth had been overshadowed by bias, where power had leaned toward the side that already held it. Yet the woman walked out with the same calm determination she had walked in with. Her disappointment was real, but so was her resolve. She had not come here to win a small victory. She had come knowing the path might be long and filled with obstacles, and though the judge had spoken his ruling, she knew something he didn't. Something that neither he nor the officers could possibly imagine. The story wasn't finished. In the quiet hallway outside the courtroom, her footsteps echoed against the polished floor. She paused for a moment, standing still as people passed by on their way to other hearings. Some glanced at her curiously, others walked on without noticing. She took a slow breath, then adjusted the strap of her bag and began to walk again. Her expression remained calm, her eyes forward. Behind her, the officers exited the courtroom, their laughter faint but sharp in the air. They walked with the ease of men who believed they were untouchable. Their lawyer patted one on the back, speaking in low tones about a clean win. But the woman didn't look back. She didn't need to, because what they didn't know, what no one in that room yet understood, was that this was not the end of her fight. She had let them underestimate her. She had let them believe they had won. And in that false confidence, they had no idea of what was waiting for them. The judge's ruling had closed one door. But in doing so, it had opened another, one that would bring a reckoning far greater than anyone in that courtroom had expected. And the woman, calm and patient, was ready to walk through it. The courtroom was almost empty now. The judge had left through his private door, the officers were still talking with their lawyer, and the last few spectators were heading out. The young woman stood by her table, sliding her documents back into her folder one by one. Her movements were calm, almost unhurried, though her heart was still heavy from what had just happened. She had walked in with the truth. She had spoken clearly, shown evidence, even played a recording. And still, the judge had dismissed it all as if none of it mattered. She had known this was possible, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. She closed her folder and placed it carefully into her bag. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the table for a moment, and she took a slow breath. Around her, the sound of laughter caught her attention. The two officers were standing near the exit with their lawyer, their voices low but smug. One leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his grin wide. The other chuckled openly, as if the whole thing had been a show put on for their amusement. Their lawyer patted one of them on the shoulder and said something that made all three of them laugh again. The woman heard every sound. She didn't look directly at them, but she could feel their confidence filling the space. To them, the case was over. To them, she was just another person who had tried and failed. The bailiff stood by the door waiting for everyone to leave. The last few people in the gallery gave the woman sympathetic glances as they passed by. No one spoke, but their eyes said enough. They had seen what had happened. They knew. Finally, the room was quiet again. Only the woman, the officers, their lawyer, and the bailiff remained. The judge's words replayed in her mind. Consider carefully before wasting the court's time. They echoed not as an insult, but as a reminder of the bias she had expected all along. She adjusted, her bag strap over her shoulder, and walked slowly toward the center of the room. Her steps were steady, her face calm. She could feel the officer's eyes on her as she passed. One of them muttered something under his breath, and the other laughed again. The lawyer, noticing her movement, smirked faintly and turned back toward his clients, already thinking about leaving for lunch, but then, just as she reached the space near the bench, the woman stopped. She turned back, facing the judge's empty seat for a brief moment. The silence of the room hung thick. Then, in a calm voice, she spoke. Not loud, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her eyes fixed on the empty chair. "I'll be sure to include today's proceedings in my federal report." Her words cut through the quiet like a sudden crack in glass. The lawyer froze. His smirk vanished instantly. The officers, both mid-laugh, went still. Their eyes snapped toward her, their expressions shifting from amusement to confusion. The bailiff blinked, glancing between her and the others, unsure of what had just happened. The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a slim leather case. With a practiced motion, she opened it and held up her identification card. The gold emblem on it caught the light. Her voice remained calm, steady, without a hint of arrogance. "I am a federal prosecutor," she said, her eyes now sweeping across the room. "My role includes monitoring judicial conduct and law enforcement accountability. I appreciate the clarity I've seen here today." The silence was complete. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not a whisper. The officers' faces lost all color. Their grins disappeared, replaced with tight jaws and darting eyes. One shifted his weight uncomfortably, his earlier confidence draining from him in an instant. The lawyer, normally quick with words, stood frozen. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been relaxed only moments ago, tightened around the folder he carried. Even the bailiff, who had stood quietly through the entire session, straightened up, his eyes wide as if he wasn't sure what to do next. The woman lowered her identification card, tucked it back into her case, and closed it gently. Her expression never changed. Calm, composed, professional. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat, didn't scold. She didn't need to. The weight of her words had already filled the entire courtroom. The officers exchanged nervous glances. For the first time all day, they looked unsure. They shifted their feet, their posture no longer relaxed but tense. The lawyer swallowed hard, glancing at the door as if looking for an escape. The woman walked toward the exit, her steps measured, her head held high. She passed the officers without a single glance in their direction. She didn't need to look at them. She already knew what their faces showed. As she reached the door, the bailiff stepped aside quickly, his respect obvious now. She gave him a small nod of thanks before stepping into the hallway. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a soft thud, leaving the others in stunned silence. Inside the courtroom, the lawyer finally found his voice. It came out low, shaky, almost a whisper. She's federal, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Neither officer answered. They stood stiffly, their earlier smugness completely gone. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on their shoulders. For them, the case was no longer a simple victory. The woman they had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated had just revealed herself as someone with far greater authority than they could have imagined. The judge's ruling, once so final, now felt fragile, like something that could be questioned, reviewed, and overturned under a sharper lens, and in that moment, the courtroom no longer belonged to the officers, or even to the judge who had dismissed her. It belonged to the truth that had just been unveiled. Meanwhile, the woman walked calmly through the hallway, her steps echoing softly against the polished floor. She passed by other people heading to their hearings, some glancing curiously at her as she moved past with quiet confidence. She did not rush. She did not linger. She simply walked forward, her face serene, her mind already on the next steps. Because for her, this was never about one ruling, one biased decision, or one dismissive remark. This was about a bigger picture, a system that needed to be held accountable. And now, with her role revealed, the story had shifted. The officers, once confident, were left in uncertainty. The lawyer, once smug, was left speechless. The judge, though not present to hear her final words, would soon feel the weight of them. The tables had turned, quietly but completely, and as the woman continued down the hallway, her calm steps carried not defeat, but the beginning of something much greater. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. The halls that usually buzzed with casual chatter now carried a sense of unease. People whispered in corners, exchanged quiet looks, and avoided speaking too loudly. News traveled fast in a building like this, and word of the previous day's hearing had already spread. Court staff, clerks, and even other attorneys had heard the same story. A young woman had stood in front of Judge Harrison's courtroom, dismissed without fairness, only to reveal at the very end that she was a federal prosecutor. No one had expected it. No one had seen it coming. The impact was immediate. In the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Harrison sat behind his large wooden desk, his usual confidence dimmed. His clerk, normally cheerful and talkative, kept quiet as she shuffled papers. The judge's pen tapped against his notepad, faster and sharper than usual. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the words the woman had spoken. "I'll be sure to include today's proceedings in my federal report." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a warning, and a very real one. Federal oversight meant his decisions could be reviewed. His conduct could be questioned. His reputation, which had taken years to build, could crumble if the wrong attention landed on him. For the first time in years, Judge Harrison felt something he hadn't felt in his own courtroom: uncertainty. Meanwhile, the two officers were sitting in a small office at the police department. The laughter they had shared the day before was gone. Their commanding officer had called them in early, and his tone had been sharp. "What exactly happened in that courtroom?" he demanded, staring them down. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth." The officers exchanged nervous looks. One tried to explain, saying they had done nothing wrong, that the judge had ruled in their favor, that the case was dismissed. But their commanding officer cut him off. "That woman is a federal prosecutor. Do you have any idea what that means? Do you have any idea what kind of spotlight you've just put on this department?" The room went quiet. The weight of his words sank in. The officers, once so sure of themselves, now felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. For the young woman, however, the morning was calm. She sat at her desk in a modest office, sipping coffee as sunlight streamed through the window. Her expression was composed, her movements unhurried. She had work to do, reports to write, meetings to attend, but in the back of her mind, she knew the events of the previous day were already in motion. She opened her laptop and began typing, carefully documenting everything she had witnessed in the courtroom, the judge's interruptions, the way her evidence was dismissed, the behavior of the officers, and the ruling that had ignored clear facts. Her words were precise, professional, without anger. This was her role. Not to argue, not to fight in frustration, but to record the truth and let it be seen where it mattered most. By midday, her report was complete. She attached supporting documents and sent it through official channels. With one simple click, the story was no longer just hers. It was in the hands of people with the power to act. Back at the courthouse, whispers grew louder. Clerks exchanged rumors. Other judges raised eyebrows. Some dismissed the story as exaggerated, but others knew it was very real. A federal prosecutor had been in their courtroom, treated unfairly, and she had walked out with evidence of everything she had seen. The officers, once confident, now found themselves under new scrutiny. An internal investigation was opened quietly, reviewing not just the stop they had made that night but other stops they had conducted in the past. Patterns began to emerge. Complaints that had been brushed aside, reports that had gone unanswered. Suddenly their spotless record didn't look so clean. And Judge Harrison? His name was mentioned in circles he wished it hadn't been. Federal oversight committees asked questions not just about that one case, but about his history of rulings. How many times had he dismissed complaints against officers? How often had he ruled in favor of law enforcement without considering evidence? Each question chipped away at the wall of authority he had built around himself. For weeks, the atmosphere in the courthouse remained uneasy. Every time the judge walked into a courtroom, he could feel the eyes on him. Every ruling he made was watched more closely. Every decision weighed against the reputation that now hung in doubt. The officers, too, carried the weight of uncertainty. Their shifts felt longer. Their interactions were observed more carefully. The confidence they once carried on the streets was gone, replaced with caution and unease. And through it all, the young woman remained steady. She didn't boast, didn't brag, didn't share her story publicly. She simply continued her work, quiet and determined, letting the system move at its own pace. Because she knew the power of patience. She knew that real change didn't come from shouting the loudest. It came from letting truth and accountability do their work. Months later, when reports finally surfaced of judicial reviews and departmental investigations, people remembered that day in the courtroom. They remembered the young woman who had walked in alone, spoken her truth calmly, been dismissed unfairly, and then revealed her true role with quiet strength. For some, it was a story of surprise. For others, it was a story of justice finally catching up. But for the woman herself, it was simply part of her duty. She had not come to humiliate anyone or to show power. She had come to witness, to record, and to make sure that what happened in that courtroom would not be forgotten. The judge who once sat so confidently now walked more carefully. The officers who once laughed so loudly now spoke more quietly. And the courthouse itself, once a place where bias could slip by unnoticed, now carried the memory of the day someone had stood up and reminded everyone that fairness mattered. And so, though the case itself had been dismissed, the real story was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive in a single ruling or a single moment. Sometimes it arrives quietly, slowly, like the steady steps of a woman walking out of a courtroom with her head held high, knowing that the truth, once revealed, cannot be silenced.